Now, like me, you probably were surprised the other day when Julian Assange was suddenly set free from Belmarsh prison by the United Kingdom authorities, and then was escorted to a waiting airplane and has been flown thousands of miles to a small island between here and Australia, where he is supposedly meant to get off the plane and sign a plea agreement which he's made with the United States judiciary, which basically is his admission, in inverted commas, to the charge of espionage, for which he is going to be granted his release, presumably based on the number of years he's already served in jail. Now, whilst all this is good, and it's nice to see Julian Assange finally being freed after all these years, and remember he spent something like 7 years barricaded in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, became an Ecuadorian citizen so that he would obtain the protections that gave. And the United States and the UK and the Western establishment ensured the downfall of the Ecuadorian government so that Julian Assange could be flushed out of his nest and presumably extradited to the United States for trial. Now, whilst all of this was happening, it's, I think, a good idea to have a look at the facts here. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are a publisher. They publish data, information, which has become available to the rest of the world, which has already been released. And in this case, it was a large chunk of leaked United States military documents, which had already been basically dumped into the internet by a whistleblower within the American defense establishment. Now, to charge somebody with espionage, which the Americans have tried to do with Julian Assange, first of all, that espionage would need to be proved. And that would mean Julian Assange would have to have been proved to have been in contact with the whistleblower and had either coerced or plotted with this individual to actually release this information and have it published. Now, that has never ever been established, and Julian Assange has vehemently denied there was any contact at all in that regard before this information was published. So the Americans have basically tried to frame this so it looks as if Julian Assange was guilty of the crime of espionage in the United States and wanted the United Kingdom to hold him pending an extradition request, which was fought for years by Julian Assange's legal team, and he had an excellent attorney, civil rights lawyer, fighting his corner. But also, interestingly, one of the things which I think is interesting about this, and looking at some of the articles written about this topic, Julian Assange was almost unique in that he had a mass mobilized audience worldwide who supported his freedom, who supported his release. And these people were in their millions, and they demonstrated daily outside of the court where he was appearing before the Old Bailey. And even the judge complained about the noise that the protesters were making. The authors of some of these reports say that without that widespread global support, Julian Assange's release may not ever have been secured in the first place. Now, to be fair, the situation is still not exactly unresolved, but Julian Assange has not cleared his name yet. He's been forced to admit to something which he was not guilty of and had not been proven to have done in the United States, but instead was incarcerated in the United Kingdom under some obscure trumped-up charge, which saw him imprisoned not in a low-security prison for what is effectively a white-collar crime of some sort. It was never really established whether he'd done anything wrong or not, but he's actually incarcerated in Belmarsh High Security Prison, where all of the murderers are kept in solitary confinement. And Julian Assange was treated as though he was a murderer. He was confined to a cell for most of the day alone, without any contact with the outside world, deprived of all the most basic human rights, which you would expect if you were in prison for something of a civil nature like this. He wasn't a violent man. He never has been a violent man. He's probably one of the most widely regarded pacifists in the world. And if you read his articles and comments, you'll see that. But when I read this, I was inspired by what was said in some of these articles about mass movements. And that's why I think this is applicable here, although this is a completely different situation that Scotland is in to that of Julian Assange. Julian Assange was basically victimised, vilified, crucified by a ravening press controlled by the United States and the United Kingdom establishment, claiming that Julian Assange was a threat to national security, both in the US and here. And the Sun is probably the worst offender in the United Kingdom for claiming that Assange was some kind of a spy, which he wasn't. So he's happily at home now with his family, thank God, and able now to start the process of thinking about how to clear his name. And I'm sure there will be massive amounts of lawsuits filed by Mr. Assange, not just against the newspapers who have libelled him, but also against the United Kingdom for false imprisonment on trumped-up charges where nothing had been proved, and they wanted to extradite him to the US, where there was no way he was going to get a fair trial, and he knew it. And this is why he insisted that if he was going to plea bargain, that he signed the plea bargain agreement not on United States soil, but on this island in the Pacific, presumably, on the way home to Australia. It's a formality, basically rubber stamping. So he's gone, and he's escaped, and he's now a free man again, and able, hopefully, to pick up the pieces. How does that apply to Scotland? Well, it doesn't really, but what does apply to Scotland is the idea of mass movements. It's widely reported all over the media at the moment, especially with regards to the United Kingdom's general election, which is coming up, that the various parties of independence, and I'm talking mainly here about the SNP and possibly ALBA, the SNP has already ruled out any electoral pact with ALBA, or any other independence party for that matter. Now, whilst in the context of a general election in the UK, that kind of makes sense, I suppose, because they're trying to get MPs elected. This is not really a case of fighting for independence at the moment, certainly not in this political arena. However, it does show a problem for all independence politicians, particularly, but not specifically in the UK, I mean also in Holyrood as well, they have the same problem. And what I'm referring to here is the structure, the political structures which have been constructed in which all of our politicians have to exist and obey the rules. We're talking here about United Kingdom control over Holyrood and also, of course, their own general election in Westminster. Now, these politicians who are standing for election in both London and Edinburgh are forced to follow the same tired old first past the post system which exists in London. And if you, like me, know your history and go back as far as 1706, just before the Act of Union was signed, you'll find that major commentators, for example Daniel Defoe, the famous English spy in the Scottish capital, stated that Scotland would get token representation. A few Scotsmen would be permitted to sit in the benches of Westminster, primarily to basically because of form, as he put it, and to be laughed at. That was basically Defoe's view, that the Scots MPs at Westminster were there just because of form, to make up the numbers, and to be laughed at by the rest of the parliamentarians. There have been other comments made by other notable writers at the time, but the point of the matter is that it was never a voluntary union. And so all the politicians that we have now who work both at Holyrood or Westminster are basically constrained by the rules imposed by Westminster on both Westminster and Holyrood, right? So they cannot do deals with each other, because to do a deal with each other would be fight for independence in an election campaign. That's something that the United Kingdom just can't stand, and this is why Scotland has a hybrid voting system. First past the post allows the SNP to get lots and lots of seats, which would be terrific, and they could maybe get a majority, as Alex Salmond famously did once, the only person who's ever done it, incidentally, in Holyrood, an absolute outright majority on the first vote. But then they introduced, of course, the so-called d'Hondt system of an additional vote for your party, and that was guaranteed to ensure that unionist politicians would be elected in large enough numbers to prevent any one party from ever achieving a full majority. And as I said, Alex Salmond was the only politician in Scotland who ever managed to do that, and they're never going to allow that to happen again. So none of our politicians can do deals with each other because they're fighting for seats within a system that's already been constructed specifically to prevent them from cooperating. It's an adversarial system. It's designed that way to produce A result or B result. It's binary. It's either, SNP or it's unionists. But there's nothing in between them. So I don't think there's going to be any electoral pacts, but it's always worth, I think, as a commentator, reading the articles of people that you may not always agree with. I watched quite a lengthy interview with Stephen Flynn on the BBC's Good Morning programme. And actually, they asked him a lot of interesting questions. But what struck me about Mr. Flynn is, first of all, his youth. He's a good deal younger than John Swinney. He's a lot more forthright and straight talking. There's not a lot of political waffle with Mr. Flynn. He's very direct. I think he has a reputation for this. What I didn't know about him was his background as a human being, and that in his teens he was afflicted with a dreadful bone condition, which caused him to lose his mobility. He became a disabled person in his teens because his bones were not getting enough blood flow. And this is a very unusual condition and has resulted in years of protracted treatments in hospital, walking on crutches, and becoming a disabled person essentially when he was a teenager. And Mr. Flynn has, as he pointed out in his interview, had cause to really be thankful for the Scottish NHS, which has brought him through those difficult years as a disabled person in severe pain all the time. He could barely walk at all, barely support his own weight because of the weakness of his bones. He's had his hip replaced. For a man of that age, that's remarkable. But he's now mobile again, and he's able to be the father he wanted to be able to carry his children around, to play with them, to take them to the park, some simple things. To my mind, his revelations, his revealing these facts about himself, I think makes Mr. Flynn an unusual politician, because he strikes me as the kind of man who entered politics not because he wanted a career, because he didn't. Originally he wanted to be a football player or something like that, like a lot of young fit people who wanted to be a fitness instructor. No way could he do these things with the disability that he was stuck with. Apologies for the picture quality there. However, now that he is in politics, he is what you would call a conviction politician. He believes in the rights of all vulnerable people, not just disabled people, but he can see it from that end of the telescope. Now, if you contrast that with Mr. Swinney, who's a professional politician with enormous experience, according to Mr. Flynn, is trusted by the people of Scotland as a steadying hand. This may be true. It may be quite true that people perceive him in that way. But if you contrast the two leaders, the Holyrood leader, Mr. Swinney, who's the party leader, with Stephen Flynn, who is the leader of the SNP at Westminster, I see two very different people here. And despite the fact that Stephen Flynn is, like many other politicians, constrained by party lines about what he can and cannot say and do, I think there is a strong reason to hope that if Stephen Flynn became the leader of the SNP, and if he were elected to Holyrood in the next Holyrood election in 2026, that his leadership would be extremely different from Mr. Swinney's. And there's a possibility that a man with that kind of conviction politics, who's not a careerist, may see the chance for himself and for his party to change and to actually form a pact, like I say, with Alba. Maybe Mr. Salmond will not be there at that time, I don't know. But if somebody like Stephen Flynn were to say, we think, or I think, that the party should change its approach and work cooperatively with all of the other parties of independence to produce a coordinated effort towards gaining independence, there would be a better chance of that happening. Now, I've said many times before that it's not going to happen through parliamentary debates, because we know that Holyrood isn't allowed to have a referendum on independence. However, having mentioned in a previous programme the work of Salvo in making representations to international organisations on behalf of Scotland to prove that we are in fact treated as a colony in everything except name, and that we have a right to both self-determination under the terms of the Charter of the United Nations. The entire founding document of it guarantees this right. And it's being denied us, incidentally, still, because we're being denied access to normal democracy. And normal democracy repeats itself every few years, like elections. There is no reason why any referendum should be once in a lifetime. This is nonsense. It was taken out of context, and it's been turned into a condition by the media. But what I'm trying to get back to here is that while Salvo is working in the background, making these representations to the European Union as part of a new type of SNP in coalition with its other pro-independence parties as partners, could also form an electoral pact with the entire independence movement, uniting all corners of independence support. And, this is the most important part, to accept and adopt support for Salvo in its international efforts and actually help that process to happen. Now, all of this can be achieved, but it needs a new leader. John Swinney is not the man for the gig. Stephen Flynn, perhaps, might be the sort of man who could do this. Watching his performance on the television today, I was struck by how natural he was and how genuine he was. There was no front, there was no waffle, there were no excuses. He just spoke his mind. Now, if that characteristic in Stephen Flynn stays there and he's not blunted by, say, becoming the leader of the SNP and eventually perhaps even the First Minister of Scotland, who knows what the future might bring. If he is the kind of man with the conviction to do what his party set out to do all those years ago when it was founded, and that is to get Scotland its freedom from the United Kingdom. And if it's not going to happen through the political structures in the UK, which we know are there to prevent it, then the only other way to do that is through international representations to the correct authorities. United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Human Rights, the European Union, the European Commission, the Council of Europe. There are all sorts of international bodies who Scotland would need to talk to. And so it needs a man who can do that and who can orchestrate all of these disparate elements, because this is what helped to get Julian Assange freed, was uniting all of these elements together, all these individual people, these parties, these organizations, these international actors, famous people, the celebrities, all of those people, the musicians, everyone who took part in the street protests and who stayed for the course. Now, yes, it took 14 years nearly before Julian Assange finally saw the light of day. But it was successful, and it was successful because the people in their millions stood up against the Western establishment. I'm not talking just about the UK, we're talking about America, the United Kingdom, perhaps even Australia. Australian politicians at the time when Mr. Assange was still in jail were shameful in their lack of support for him. And it was only a change of political leadership in Australia which changed that support, and the Australian government joined in with the rest of the global community to demand his release. And that's what we need here in Scotland. We need that level of orchestration, but we need somebody who can lead it and who is impermeable to the smear attempts of the United Kingdom. Somebody who is a straight talker, a man whose history is already known, who does not have skeletons in his cupboard and is not going to ever be proved to have had any kind of corruption around him. And I think somebody like Stephen Flynn would be the guy for the job. I'm not saying it's him, but from what I've seen of him, he looks to me the right kind of guy to lead Scotland towards independence on this much broader stage, this international stage. The United Kingdom's not going to allow it politically. We have to act outside of that. We have to gain support in every other country. There have to be people out on the streets demanding that we are allowed to vote. I know the Catalans will definitely support us, and there are many other former United Kingdom colonies which have been liberated from their colonial status over the last 100 years, something like 65 of them, I believe. I could be wrong. And they would all support us as well. And once you have countries, entire countries, supporting your right to self-determination, and they start saying that to the United Nations, that can't be ignored anymore. because other countries are saying it. This is going to require a big effort, and I'm not trying to minimize just how large a colossal undertaking this would be. But this is what we're left with, and this is the kind of person we need to lead it. Now, I'm talking about Stephen Flynn here because he's just one man that I've seen on the TV, but there may well be other politicians out there who could do this. People, for example, like Colette Walker, who leads the Independence for Scotland party. Now, Colette is registered blind, and she's a brilliant politician, a completely steady person, and as Wings Over Scotland said recently, she's one of the good guys. Having prepared for this programme a little bit by reading some more, I actually spent some time reading Stuart Campbell's recent column in Wings Over Scotland about the Hobson's choice facing Scottish voters. Who do you vote for? And the suggestion, of course, is that by not voting for the SNP, either by staying at home or by voting for another independence party that's smaller, this might be the only way that the current breed of politicians under John Swinney in Holyrood get the message that what they're doing is wrong. Because when people start losing their seats, and politicians, remember, they want to keep their seats, they want to keep their jobs, but when there's a threat to it because of the policies of their own parties, that may be the only time that the leadership of that party will change, and a new person will step in and say, this is enough of this. We're changing our policy. We're going to do what our supporters are asking us to do instead of what we think might be the best thing for us. And that's where a conviction politician, perhaps like Stephen Flynn, is going to win. This is a lot of conjecture, and I'm sure lots of you saying there, but this is the SNP. They're not going to do deals with anybody. And they're right, they're not going to do deals with anybody at the moment, certainly not under Mr. Swinney and under the current continuity party that the SNP has become. And it's decline into a kind of totalitarian bubble party which doesn't listen to its own members is well documented elsewhere. But this is the way parties go. It's exactly the same way the Labour Party went in Scotland when it assumed that everybody would keep voting for them, even when they were doing really stupid things. And it's that assumption that people are stupid enough to keep voting for you when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing that is going to finish a party like the SNP. Now, I can't tell people how to vote. But if the SNP vote collapses completely, and yeah, okay, some Labour Party MPs are elected in Scotland, it doesn't change the dial of independence at all one way or the other. Okay, it gives the United Kingdom's media a chance to crow about some kind of defeat for the SNP, the end of the independence fight forever. Yeah, okay, they're going to say that anyway, no matter what happens. But then there's 2026. And then there's the opportunity for the SNP to change its leadership, to change its government, its ministers, and to go into that election on a completely different manifesto from the one that they currently have. Something far more radical, but something which is much more encompassing of the over 2 million Scottish voters now who are demanding independence, because we know that support for independence is past the 50% mark. And 50% of the current electorate is approximately 2 million people. That's virtually half of the voting population of this country is already committed, wanting independence. The SNP merely just needs to pick up the ball and kick it in the net. And that requires a man with some vision and the backbone to take that difficult decision, to pull all the threads of independent support together, including the other parties like Albert. And St. Alex Summit, look, we've had some bad blood in the past, but we're under new management now, and we want the two parties to work together. How can we do this? Let's bring in the ISP. Let's bring in the Scottish Socialist Party as well. Let's talk to all the smaller parties. Let's see if we can build a huge coalition for independence and involve the independence movement at large in the process. This is all that any country needs if it wants to become free. Why is it the Scottish country is different from everywhere else? Why is it that when we should be fighting for our freedom, we're squabbling amongst ourselves? Well, it's because the British government's put us in a playpen and said you can't actually get out of this playpen, so you're just going to have to fight over who has the best position in the pen. That's not good enough. It's time that changed. And the only way to change that is to think outside of that constructed playpen and look at the bigger international picture. That can be done. The support for Scotland exists all over the world at the moment. And they're all looking at us going, why aren't you asking us for support? Why aren't you involving us? Why are you fighting amongst yourselves? The simple answer to that is because the British government has set us against one another and said, you guys in Scotland, you just squabble amongst yourselves. You're irrelevant. You're here in Westminster to be laughed at. You don't have any power and you're never going to get any as long as we control it. That's what needs to change. If you don't look outside the box, well, you never see freedom. You see four walls, just like Julian Assange has seen for the last 10 years or so. But he got out because the world rallied to his support. We'll get out of the UK for a similar reason. But it's up to us to reach out to all of these disparate pieces of support. Not just here in Scotland, and not just the parties, not just the organisations and the independence movement here, but everywhere else as well. I guess that's my rant for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. As usual, if you'd like to donate to the channel, you can do so. I will try and my PayPal link again. I know that my other YouTube editor Stevie will be posting probably this blog online again on his own channel, Freedom. I think it's Freedom for Scotland channel he's now calling it. So you may see the link there. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's content. And as usual, if you have any comments, suggestions, criticisms, I don't care what they are, then tell me. If I've got anything wrong, also tell me so I can correct it. In the meantime, keep the faith. It's very important. Don't descend into squabbling. Don't fight with members of other parties. Stop the bickering. Stop the name calling. And stop worrying about who said what to who last year. That doesn't matter anymore. We need to look at the future, not the past. See you soon. Bye for now.